The world America made for us is passing away. Its place is being taken by a new and harder post-American world. We are at a loss to know what to make of it and how to make our way in it. Our leaders are still in denial about all this.
Hi, and welcome to the first episode of Indo-Pacific Briefing. The mission of the Australian Institute of International Affairs is to help Australians know, understand and engage more in international affairs. This inaugural episode considers the harsh, complex and uncertain geopolitical realities currently facing Australia. In this episode, we are joined by Professor Hugh White. Hugh is a Fellow of the Institute, one of Australia's leading defence analysts, a sharp policy mind and strategic thinker. He has been an advisor to Prime Ministers and Defence Ministers, a Deputy Secretary in the Department of Defence, and the first head of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and now author of the recent publication, Hard New World, Our Post-American Future, where he poses the question, are we ready for our post-American future?
Because when Australians think about our relationship with the United States, we've been close allies of the US for so long that we find it very hard to imagine what it would be like to have a relationship with America, which wasn't based on an alliance.
When it comes to protection and friendship, I wonder whether you think that the United States will go all the way from there to come and help Australia in case of need, in comparison to Israel, for example.
Yeah, so if Australia was attacked, could we expect the United States to come and help us? Look, it's a really important question because, of course, the expectation that the answer is yes, that we can rely on the United States to defend us if all else fails, is right at the heart of our alliance with the United States, and of course that means right at the heart of our whole approach to our place in the world. And I think it used to be true that we could rely on that. And the reason for that is not because the Americans are very nice people, or that we're very nice people. It was that it suited America's strategic interests and objectives to support Australia because Australia was a piece for the Americans in their broad strategic posture in the Western Pacific, and they were very committed to sustaining that posture. If you think of the war with Japan, of course, from 1941 through to 1945, and then the Cold War in the decades after that, and then in the post-Cold War era in the decades after that, the decades up to about 15 years ago. But it does seem to me that the United States now faces new choices about whether it wants to maintain a strong position in the Western Pacific, despite what some people in Washington say, particularly people in the Biden administration. I don't think in the end they are serious about sustaining their position in the Western Pacific. And if they're not serious about that, then they don't really need an alliance with Australia. And if they don't need an alliance with Australia, then we can't depend on them to come and defend us. So I think that an alliance which has worked very well for Australia for a long time doesn't work so well for us now, won't work so well for us in the future. And of course, one of the things to bear in mind in this business is that we always have to focus a long way forward. I mean, it's not just about defence equipment, but defence equipment is part of the picture. And, you know, the submarines, for example, that will be operating 30 or 40 years from now are the submarines we're buying today. So we have to, when we think about the future of our capabilities and when we think about the future of our alliances, we have to think not what's going to happen this year or next year, but where should we prudently expect to be 30 or 40 years from now? 30 or 40 years from now, I think the chances of the United States will be the kind of ally for Australia that we believe it's been in the past and that we dearly love it to be in the future. I don't think we can soberly base our future defence planning on that expectation. So my short answer to your question is no. The Canberra establishment is shocked by any suggestion that we should walk away from the ANZUS commitments. They think that we can and must depend on America more than ever in today's hard new world. But that misses the vital point. It's not Australia, but America that's walking away from the commitments it made in the ANZUS Treaty in very different circumstances 75 years ago. That was plain enough under Joe Biden. It's crystal clear today under Trump. This is the lesson we must draw from Washington's failure to defend Ukraine. And no country has benefited more than Australia has, because no country has seen such extraordinary economic opportunities open up with China's demands for our exports. And at the same time, we haven't suffered much from China's replacement by our imports from China, because we didn't really have much manufacturing industry to start with. I think China wants a country which is a reliable trade partner and which accepts China playing a bigger role in the region, is prepared to see China becoming the region's leading power, and above all, it wants a country in Australia, as every other country, that doesn't threaten what China's doing internally, that it doesn't challenge the leading role of the Communist Party in China. I don't think the Chinese want to make Australia just like China. They don't have that kind of sense of themselves, but they do want to make sure that nothing happens in Australia that upsets their vision of how China should work. I think the centre of gravity of China's strategic ambition is to be the leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. And I think that's the sensible objective from China's point of view. I think China is determined to push America out of East Asia and the Western Pacific and to take its place as the region's leading power, and I think it's going to be strong enough to do that. America's got three options. It can push back, it can give up, or it can go halfway and do some kind of deal, some sort of compromise. I think the most likely outcome is that America will step back and leave China to be the primary power in our region. The best outcome for Australia would be America to retain a significant role in Asia but not seek to continue to dominate. I used to think that was a real possibility. I think it's now vanishingly unlikely, so the best possible outcome is for the United States to withdraw. Not that I would like that to happen, but I just think it's better than the alternative of the US trying to remain in Asia, contest China's challenge, see rivalry between them escalate, and see the risk of war grow. Ever since Australia withdrew our forces from Vietnam in 1972, we have not fired a shot in anger in Asia in support of the United States. Yes. So we had this alliance with the United States, which, our political leaders and our bureaucrats and our scholars, for that matter, talked about being very close and, very intimate and very committed and all of that sort of stuff. But actually we didn't do much. What we did was to go to the Middle East. So periodically, from about 1980 onwards, whenever anything happened in the Middle East and America wanted to use armed force, we'd stick our hands up and say, off we go. So we went to the Middle East, but that was easy for us because we don't have any really big equities in the Middle East. If we ended up going to war with Iraq, for example, or Afghanistan, that didn't really affect Australian equities. Mm-hmm. Partly because they were a long way from here, partly because they weren't very strong, they weren't very significant trading partners and so on. And that was because throughout that period, really since 1972, when Nixon went to China and sat down with Mao Zedong and the beginning of the rapprochement between a communist China and the United States, that whole process started to unfold. From then on, America's political position, strategic position in East Asia was essentially uncontested. So America had no one trying to push it out of the region, so Australia didn't have to do anything to support the United States to stay in the region. Yes. Now that, of course, started to change when China emerged as a strategic rival of the United States. Now the historians are going to have some fun deciding exactly when that was, but I think they're going to decide it was somewhere between 2008 and 2010. That was the point where China started to emerge as a really serious challenger to the United States in Asia. Now ever since then, Australia has found itself in a very different position. Instead of being the kind of free-riding, silent partner of an uncontested dominant power, we've been a subordinate ally of a power facing an increasingly significant challenge. People say the intelligence relationship with the United States is so close and so important to both sides as to be unbreakable. But don't bet on that. US access to Pine Gap as a location for its satellite ground station is valuable, but very far from essential. Likewise, our access to US intelligence under the Five Eyes arrangements is very valuable to us, but we could do without it. I don't think any country can win a war against China on an issue that really matters to China, just as no country can win a war with America on an issue that really matters to America. On an issue like Taiwan, for example, I think China would just keep going no matter what was required. And unless the United States or some other adversary could occupy China, occupy Beijing, change the government, which is what we did after the end of the Second World War, I don't think you can push the Chinese off that objective. And that kind of victory over China is just not possible.
Professor White,
Yep.
You're fully confident that Australia will never get the submarines. But what if Australia commits to going to war against China over Taiwan? Then it's highly probable that the United States will hand them the submarines.
Well, let me just slightly turn that argument over.
All right.
If we don't commit
Yes.
to go to war alongside the United States in the event of a US-China war over something like Taiwan, then I think we're pretty much certain not to get the submarines, because the whole logic from America's point of view of passing us the submarines presupposes that it's no real loss for the United States for Australia to have some of their Virginia-class submarines, because they'd anyway be available to the United States just as they would have been had they been part of the US Navy. And so it's been, I think, clear for a long time, and it's a bit clearer now after even clearer now after the announcement of the Pentagon's review of AUKUS. That is really for Washington a necessary condition for the whole thing going forward. If I was the guy doing the review, and the bloke who's doing the review is a guy called Elbridge Colby, who I know a little bit and who is a very capable person. I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but he's a very capable policymaker. And I say that because most of the people, all of the people above him in the Trump administration, I wouldn't let in the door. Elbridge Colby had let in the door. He's a very capable bloke. So the smart thing for him to do is not to say, this is not going to happen. It's to say this is only going to happen if. And I think there are going to be two ifs. The first is the one that you mentioned, that is whether or not Australia is prepared to commit to send any submarines America passes us to go to war with them against China. The second is whether or not the United States' own submarine industry can start building enough submarines so that they have enough submarines to spare to pass some to Australia.
Yes.
This seems to me to be the other, from America's point of view, the other roadblock on the AUKUS path. The United States is, frankly, desperately short of submarines. Its submarine construction and maintenance capability, like most other things about the US defence sort of posture, declined very sharply after the Cold War because they didn't think they were going to be having to fight any serious wars in future. And then over the last, decade and a half, when they've started to think more seriously about the fact that they might have to fight serious wars, their submarine construction and maintenance capability hasn't increased.
Yes.
It's been very clear right from the beginning that unless the build rate in the US yards could get up to 2 submarines a year, there'd be no chance of them giving us any.
Yes.
And what they really want is to get them to 2.3 submarines a year so that they can pass submarines to us while still achieving their own 2 boats a year objective. Now, never say never. Miracles sometimes happen, not very often. And I think it would be extremely optimistic to presuppose that the US yards, in the time frames required, which are actually pretty quick. I mean, we're talking less than a decade now before the subs are meant to be delivered, that the US yards are going to get to 2.3 boats a year. So I think what Elbridge Colby will conclude is, because he's a polite person.
Yes.
So he'll say, quite an attractive idea, but some real questions about it. So let's just warn Australia that you won't get the submarines unless our build rate hits 2.3 boats a year. And by the way, if you want to help, send us another $5 billion. And we won't provide you with any submarines unless you're willing to commit to go to war with China over Taiwan. Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong occasionally conjured a different vision. In some of her speeches, she hinted that America should step back to a balancing role in Asia. As we have seen, this is an appealing idea that would serve Australia well, easing US-China tensions while setting some limits on China's power. But as we've also seen, the idea has little appeal in Washington and none at all in Beijing. Wong knows that, so her musings were most likely designed to appeal to Southeast Asian audiences, who were anxious that America's hopes to retain primacy were fueling dangerous rivalry. What happens when America steps back? Instead of a unipolar order dominated by one overwhelmingly powerful leading country, we will see a global multipolar order in which a number of great powers play more or less equal roles in shaping world affairs through a complex combination of competition, accommodation, and cooperation. It will always be difficult and sometimes dangerous, but this can be made to work. The example of Europe in the 19th century shows how great power rivalries can be managed to avoid any one power dominating, to allow trade to flourish, and mostly to keep the peace. The stronger Indonesia is, the more it can do for us as a potential ally, but the more it can do against us as a potential adversary. And it's going to be partly up to them and partly up to us which Indonesia turns out to be. Managing our relationship with Indonesia to emphasise the positives and minimise the negatives is going to be one of the great foreign policy challenges for Australia in the decades ahead as Indonesia's power grows. We're going to have to get over our alliance addiction and learn to live without great and powerful friends. I think the really critical thing for Australia's armed forces is to be able to raise the costs and risks to a great power adversary like China or India in the future if they prove to be a threat, to the point where the potential adversary simply decides it's not worth their while. It is going to be difficult for Australia to make its way in the new world that follows the short but easy era of US global primacy. But this is a world we can work with if we are prepared to face up to its demands.
That concludes this episode of Indo-Pacific Briefing with Professor Hugh White. As we move towards a world previously dominated by a single hegemonic power to a multipolar world, we see countries jostle for a place in Tier 1 of this new world order. The key questions arise: is Australia ready for this new world order? Is our national interest served well by our current alliances and partnerships? And what's required? Courage and vision, inspired by the actions of folks like Doc Evatt, and a need to recognise we are in a new multipolar world, a hard reality check required to break us free from our complacency and move beyond a fear of abandonment. Thank you for joining us.